Story 1. The Woman on the Trail. I grew up in a town that most people would drive through without noticing. The kind of place where the main street has more closed storefronts than open ones, and everybody knows everybody else's business before the gossip even has time to spread. And our house was situated almost a mile into the woods off a dirt trail that barely qualified as a road. Just 2 tire tracks separated by a strip of grass and weeds that my father mowed down once a month during summer. My dad had built the house himself with help from my grandfather back in the 90s, long before I was born, and they'd chosen the location specifically because they wanted privacy, wanted to be surrounded by trees and wildlife instead of neighbors and traffic. And for most of my childhood, I loved that isolation. Loved the way the forest felt like our own private kingdom, where we made the rules and the rest of the world couldn't intrude. But when I started high school that September, the isolation became more complicated because the school buses wouldn't come down our trail. Said it was too narrow and poorly maintained for a vehicle that size. So every morning I had to walk either a mile to my friend Derek's house where the bus would pick us both up, or 2.5 miles directly to school if I felt like getting exercise and solitude before facing the chaos of classrooms and hallways. Most days I chose to walk all the way to school because Derek was perpetually late and I hated the anxiety of wondering if we'd missed the bus. Plus, I enjoyed the quiet meditation of the walk. The way the morning light filtered through the canopy of leaves and made everything look softer and more forgiving than it would later in the harsh afternoon sun. It was late September, maybe 3 weeks into the school year, when I first saw the car, an old sedan, maybe from the early 2000s, parked on the trail about halfway between our house and the main road. And my first thought was that someone had broken down and abandoned it overnight. But as I got closer, I realized there was someone inside, a woman sitting in the driver's seat, and she was looking at me through the windshield with an expression I couldn't quite read from that distance. I slowed my pace, suddenly uncertain whether I should continue past the car or turn around and go back home. But turning around felt cowardly and irrational. It was just a person in a car, probably lost or waiting for someone. Nothing threatening about that, so I kept walking and tried to appear casual. Tried not to look directly at her, even though I could feel her eyes tracking my movement. As I drew level with the car, I risked a quick glance and immediately wished I hadn't, because the woman looked wrong in a way that had nothing to do with her appearance and everything to do with her presence. She had dark circles under her eyes, like she hadn't slept in days. Hair that hung in greasy strands around her face. And she was staring at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Not angry or threatening exactly, just focused in a way that felt predatory. Like I was prey she'd been waiting for. I walked faster once I passed the car, resisting the urge to look back over my shoulder. And I didn't relax until I'd reached the main road and the trail was behind me. And even then, I kept thinking about her eyes. About the way she'd watched me, like she was memorizing every detail of my face and body and gait. At school that day, I couldn't concentrate on anything. My mind kept returning to the woman in the car, inventing explanations for her presence. Maybe she was a real estate agent, checking out properties in the area. Maybe she was a hiker who'd gotten turned around and was using the trail to find her bearings. Maybe she was just someone having a bad day who'd pulled over to collect herself, before continuing on with whatever sad life had brought her to that particular spot at that particular time. When I got home that afternoon, I mentioned it to my parents at dinner, described the car and the woman in a casual tone, like it was just an interesting detail from my day, and not something that had actually unsettled me. and I watched their faces carefully as I spoke. And what I saw there was not the dismissive reassurance I'd expected, but rather a flash of something that looked like recognition, followed immediately by concern. My father and mother exchanged a glance, one of those married couple looks that communicates an entire conversation in a split second. And then my dad said the woman was probably just lost, that our trail wasn't marked, and sometimes people turn down it by mistake, thinking it led somewhere public. And my mum nodded agreement a bit too enthusiastically, and I knew they were lying to me, knew there was something they weren't saying. But I also knew from years of experience that pushing them for information they didn't want to share would only make them more defensive and tight-lipped. For the next week, my father drove me to school every morning, even though it meant he had to leave for his construction job 40 minutes later than usual. And my mother picked me up every afternoon, even though her shift at the diner didn't end until 4. And they never explained this sudden change in routine. Never acknowledged that it was connected to the woman in the car. Just acted like driving me to and from school was something they'd always planned to do. I appreciated not having to walk alone, but I also felt frustrated by their protectiveness. I was 14 years old, not a child, and whatever they were worried about felt exaggerated and paranoid. But I didn't argue, because the truth was, I didn't particularly want to encounter that woman again anyway. Didn't want to see those tired, predatory eyes watching me from inside her sad little car. By the second Monday of October, I'd convinced myself that whatever had concerned my parents was over. That the woman had been a temporary anomaly who'd moved on to whatever destination she'd been seeking. And I told my parents I wanted to walk to school again. That I missed the exercise and the morning solitude. And after some discussion, they reluctantly agreed, though I noticed my mother watched from the porch until I disappeared down the trail, and my father made me promise to call him immediately if I saw anything unusual. The walk that morning was perfect, cool autumn air and golden light slanting through the trees, and I felt silly for having been afraid. Felt embarrassed by my overactive imagination that had transformed a lost traveler into some kind of threat. And I was so relaxed and distracted by the beauty around me that I almost didn't notice the car until I was 20 feet away from it. The same sedan parked in almost the exact same spot as before, and the woman was there again, sitting in the driver's seat. And when she saw me, she immediately opened her door and stood up. And I stopped walking, every muscle in my body tensing for flight. The woman stood beside her car with the door hanging open and one hand resting on the roof. Her posture casual, but her eyes locked onto me with that same unsettling intensity I remembered from our first encounter. And for a few seconds, neither of us moved. We just stared at each other across the 20 feet of dirt trail that separated us. And I could see now, in the better light, that she was probably in her late 30s or early 40s, wearing clothes that looked like they'd been slept in, jeans with stains on the knees, and an oversized sweater that hung off one shoulder.
I had to do it.
I made a decision in that moment. Whether it was the right decision, I still don't know. But I decided that I wasn't going to walk past her again. Wasn't going to put myself within arm's reach of someone who'd been waiting on this trail for a week just to see me pass by. So I turned 90 degrees and started walking directly into the woods, not running but moving with purpose, heading perpendicular to the trail toward the general direction of school, figuring I could navigate through the forest and emerge somewhere near the main road if I kept the morning sun on my left. I heard her car door slam shut and then the engine turning over, and I resisted the urge to look back, just kept walking through the underbrush, stepping over fallen logs and pushing through clusters of saplings, and I could hear her car moving slowly along the trail, trying to keep pace with me. the engine revving and tires crunching over gravel and dirt. The woods were thick enough that she couldn't see me clearly through the trees, but I could still see her car through gaps in the foliage, and I realized with growing panic that she was going to follow me as far as the trail allowed, was going to track my movement until I either came back to the path or disappeared completely from her sight. And neither option felt safe anymore, so I changed direction, angling deeper into the woods, moving faster now. My backpack bouncing against my spine and branches scratching at my face and arms. I thought I'd lost her when the sound of the engine faded behind me. Thought the trees had finally become too dense for her to see through, and I slowed my pace slightly, breathing hard, trying to get my bearings and figure out which direction would take me back toward civilization. And that's when I heard her voice cutting through the forest, calling out a name, calling out my name. My full name that appeared on school rosters and legal documents, but that nobody actually used in daily conversation. She called it again, Michael Anthony Brenner, drawing out each syllable like she was tasting them. And her tone was wrong, too gentle and loving for a stranger, too familiar for someone who should have no idea who I was. And the sound of my full name in her mouth made me feel violated in a way I couldn't articulate, like she'd stolen something private and was now displaying it publicly without my permission. I started running then, really running, crashing through the undergrowth without caring about the noise I was making, driven by a primal fear that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with the certain knowledge that this woman meant me harm, that whatever she wanted from me was nothing I could afford to give. And I could still hear her calling my name behind me, her voice growing fainter but never quite disappearing. Michael Anthony Brenner, over and over like an incantation or prayer. I don't know how long I ran, maybe 10 minutes, maybe 20. Time had stopped meaning anything beyond the immediate need to put distance between myself and that voice. And eventually I burst out of the tree line onto someone's back property, a house I didn't recognize, with a yard full of plastic toys and an above-ground pool covered with a tarp. And I ran around to the front and kept going until I reached a road I knew. And only then did I stop and bend over with my hands on my knees, gasping for air and trying not to vomit from exertion and fear. I walked the remaining distance to school in a daze, arriving 40 minutes late to my first period class. And when the teacher asked where I'd been, I mumbled something about oversleeping, and she marked me tardy without further questions. And I spent the rest of the day in a fog of adrenaline and confusion, barely hearing anything my teacher said, just replaying the woman's voice in my head, the way she'd called my full name like she'd known me my entire life. That afternoon, my mother picked me up as usual, and I got in the car without speaking. And she immediately knew something was wrong, asked me what happened, and I told her everything. About the woman waiting on the trail again, about her following me in her car, about her calling out my full name in the woods. And I watched my mother's face drain of color as I spoke, watched her hands tighten on the steering wheel until her knuckles went white. And when I finished, she didn't say anything for almost a full minute, just drove in silence while tears started running down her cheeks. We didn't go home. Instead, my mother drove to my father's construction site and pulled him aside. And I sat in the car watching them talk, watching my father's expression change from confusion to anger to something that looked almost like grief. And then they both came back to the car, and my father said we needed to go to the police station right now, that this couldn't wait another hour or another day. And I asked what was going on. Who was this woman and how did she know my name? But neither of them answered. They just looked at each other with those same silent married couple expressions that excluded me completely. At the police station, my parents spoke with an officer for 20 minutes while I sat in the waiting area. And when they finally came out, my father's face was grim and determined. And the officer said they'd send a patrol car to check the trail immediately. And they'd follow up on some information my parents had provided. And we should go home and lock the doors and call if anything else happened. On the drive home, I demanded answers, and my father finally told me the truth. Or at least part of it. Told me the woman was his ex-wife from before he married my mother. A woman named Carol, who he'd divorced almost 20 years ago after she'd had what he called a mental breakdown. And she'd been in and out of psychiatric facilities ever since. And they hadn't heard from her in over a decade and had hoped she'd moved on with her life. But apparently she'd found out where we lived somehow, had been watching our house and learning my schedule and waiting for opportunities to approach me when I was alone. I asked why, what did she want? And my father said Carol had always had problems with obsession. That during their marriage she'd fixated on various people and ideas to the point where she couldn't function normally, and the doctors said it was a symptom of her illness, that she couldn't control these compulsions even when she understood they were irrational. And now apparently she'd fixated on me for reasons that probably didn't make sense even to her. My mother added that Carol had never had children of her own, that it was one of the things that contributed to the divorce. And maybe seeing me had triggered some kind of maternal delusion in her damaged mind. Some fantasy where I was her son instead of the child my father had with someone else. But this was all speculation. We couldn't really know what was going on in Carol's head or what she'd been planning when she called out my name in the woods. Story 2. The customer in the closet. I worked at a small grocery store on the south side of town, one of those family-owned places that somehow survived despite chain supermarkets everywhere. And I'd been there almost 2 years, working mostly closing shifts because I took morning classes at community college and the late schedule fit my life better. Plus closing paid an extra $1 per hour, which I desperately needed for rent. The store closed at 10 p.m. and we had regular customers who came at predictable times, and most of them were decent people. Tired folks picking up milk after work, or elderly customers who came for conversation as much as groceries. But there was one customer everyone who worked closing shifts knew about. A man who came in 2 or 3 times a week, always around 9:45. Always buying just a few random items like crackers and canned soup. And he never spoke beyond yes or no about receipts, never made eye contact. Never showed any expression except a kind of blank exhaustion that made him look like he was sleepwalking through life. The first few times I rang him up, I tried being friendly, asked how his evening was, commented on weather, the usual retail small talk, but he never responded with more than a grunt or nod. And eventually I stopped trying and just processed his transactions in silence, like the other employees had learnt to do. There was something unsettling about him I couldn't identify. Nothing specific I could point to. He wasn't threatening or inappropriate. Didn't stare or make weird comments. He was just profoundly empty in a way that made my skin crawl. Like there was nothing behind his eyes except darkness that would swallow you if you looked too long. It was a Tuesday in late November, one of those cold nights where rain comes down in sheets and wind rattles the store's windows. And business was slow, maybe 6 customers in 2 hours, and I'd spent most of my shift restocking shelves and cleaning. Looking forward to closing up and going home to my apartment for a hot shower. At 9:47, the door chimed and I looked up from the magazine I'd been reading. And of course, it was him, the silent customer. wearing that same tired expression and dark jacket. And he grabbed a basket and disappeared into the aisles while I mentally prepared for another wordless transaction. He took his time shopping, wandering slowly, and I could track his movement by the squeaking of his shoes on linoleum. And at 9:58, he came to the register with chili, crackers, and generic aspirin. And I scanned everything and told him the total, and he paid in exact change, like always, counting out bills and coins with slow, deliberate movements. And then he took his bag and walked toward the exit. And I thought that was the end of it, another unremarkable encounter. But as I watched him walk to the door, he paused for a second, turned his head and looked back at me with an expression I'd never seen on his face before. Something that might have been recognition or interest or calculation. And then he pushed through the door and disappeared into the rainy darkness. And I felt a cold shiver run down my spine for no reason I could explain. I finished closing duties, counting the register and mopping floors and turning off lights except the security lamp by the back entrance. And I locked up at 10:23, running through rain to my car parked in the employee section at the far end of the lot. And I noticed there was still one other car in the lot, a sedan parked near the store entrance. And I wondered if someone had left their vehicle overnight, or if a customer was sitting inside waiting for rain to let up. I drove the 15 minutes to my apartment thinking about nothing particular. The usual post-work fog where your brain is too tired to engage, so you just exist in pleasant numbness. And I parked and ran through rain to my building, upstairs to the second floor, and let myself into an apartment to see where I immediately kicked off wet shoes and peeled off my soaked jacket. I made a sandwich, even though it was nearly 11, because I'd skipped dinner, and I ate it, scrolling through my phone, looking at nothing important, just letting my mind decompress from 8 hours of forced customer service smiles. And around midnight, I dragged myself to the bathroom to brush my teeth and wash my face. Then went to my bedroom and collapsed onto bed without changing out of work clothes. Just pulled the blanket over myself and let exhaustion drag me into sleep. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. My phone was charging across the room, so I couldn't check. But the darkness outside suggested somewhere between 2 and 4 a.m., when even night owls have gone to bed. And I woke because I thought I heard my phone ringing, that distinctive buzzing against my dresser. But when I opened my eyes and listened, I heard nothing except the refrigerator humming and distant rain still falling. I lay there in that confused state between sleep and waking, trying to decide if the phone sound was real or part of a dream I was already forgetting. And I was about to roll over and go back to sleep when I noticed something that made my blood freeze. The bedroom door was open. Not wide open, but cracked 3 or 4 inches. Enough to see a sliver of darker hallway beyond. And I always closed my bedroom door before sleep. It was an unconscious habit since childhood. I couldn't sleep with the door open. Couldn't relax without that barrier between myself and the rest of the apartment. I stared at the door for what felt like several minutes, but was probably only 30 or 40 seconds. My mind racing through possible explanations. Maybe I'd been so tired I forgot to close it properly. Maybe the door frame was warped and it swung open on its own. Maybe the building's ventilation created enough air pressure to push it ajar. And all these explanations felt plausible enough that I almost convinced myself everything was fine. Almost rolled over and went back to sleep, but something was nagging at the back of my consciousness. Some instinct screaming that the door being open was not okay, was in fact very much not okay. I sat up slowly, my heart starting to beat faster, and I looked around my bedroom checking for anything else that seemed out of place. And that's when I saw it through the window. The sliver of view I had of the parking lot from my bed. There was a car parked in one of the visitor spots directly below my building. A sedan that I was almost certain was the same one I'd seen in the grocery store parking lot after my shift. And I felt my stomach drop because that couldn't be coincidence, couldn't be random chance. And suddenly, all those harmless explanations for the open door evaporated and were replaced by a single terrifying possibility that someone was in my apartment. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just sat perfectly still in bed, listening with every fiber of my being for any sound that would confirm or deny my suspicion. My phone was still across the room on the dresser, charging, and I needed to get to it, needed to call 911. But that would require getting out of bed and crossing the room. And I was terrified that any movement would alert whoever might be hiding in my apartment that I was awake, that I'd noticed something was wrong. And then what would happen? Would they run? Would they attack? Would they do whatever terrible thing they'd come here to do? I decided I had to move, had to take that risk because sitting frozen in bed wasn't going to protect me. And I slowly pulled back the blanket and swung my legs over the side of the mattress. And the box spring creaked slightly under the shift in weight, and I froze again, listening, and I heard nothing in response, so I continued, placing my feet carefully on carpet and standing up. And every movement felt exaggerated and loud, even though objectively I was being as quiet as possible. I took one step toward the dresser, then another, and I was maybe 3 feet away from my phone when I made the mistake of glancing toward the closet. The sliding door was open, about 6 inches, just a narrow gap of darkness. And I knew with absolute certainty that I'd closed that door before getting into bed because I'd hung up my wet jacket and then slid the door shut. I specifically remembered doing it, and now it was open and something was different about the darkness inside. There was a density to it that suggested the presence of mass, of volume, of something that didn't belong in an empty closet. I should have run right then. Should have sprinted out of the bedroom and out of the apartment and down to the street, screaming for help. But instead, I stood paralyzed, staring at that narrow gap of darkness, trying to convince myself I was imagining things, that my fear was creating shapes where none existed. But then the darkness moved, shifted slightly, and I saw it, an eye. A single human eye reflecting the faint ambient light from my window, looking back at me from inside the closet. And the eye was wet and unblinking and filled with an intelligence that was aware of me, aware that I'd seen it, aware that whatever game we'd been playing was now over. I didn't remember making the decision to run. My body just moved on its own. Pure survival instinct overriding conscious thought. And I lunged for the bedroom door and yanked it fully open and ran through it into the hallway. And behind me, I heard the closet door sliding open with a harsh scraping sound and footsteps hitting the carpet. Heavy footsteps that were definitely real and definitely chasing me. And I was screaming now, screaming at the top of my lungs as I ran through the short hallway into the living room and toward the front door. And my hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the deadbolt lock. I had to try twice before I got it turned and the door open, and I burst out into the exterior hallway of my apartment building, still screaming. And immediately the door to apartment 2B flew open, and my neighbor, an older man named Mr. Chen, who I'd spoken to maybe 3 times in the year I'd lived here, appeared in his doorway in pajamas, looking alarmed and confused. I was crying and hyperventilating and trying to explain that someone was in my apartment. Someone had been hiding in my closet, and Mr. Chen took charge immediately, told me to stay in his apartment while he called police,
You have to help me, Mr.
and he walked
Chen.
me into his living
Please.
room and sat me down on his couch and handed me his phone after dialing 911. And I spoke to the operator, or tried to, my words coming out in broken fragments between sobs. And she kept telling me to stay calm, that officers were on their way, that I was safe now, but I didn't feel safe. I felt like my entire sense of security had been shattered and would never be whole again. Mr. Chen got dressed and went out into the hallway to watch my apartment door and make sure no one came out. And he called to me a few minutes later that he could see someone had left.
He watches that door every night.
My door was still hanging open, but there was no movement inside.
They were here.
And then we heard sirens approaching, and 3 police officers arrived within minutes. And they searched my apartment with their weapons drawn, going through every room, every closet, checking under the bed and behind the shower curtain. And they confirmed that whoever had been there was gone now, had fled sometime in the chaos of my escape.
The questions begin.
The officers asked me hundreds of questions. When had I gotten home? Had I locked the door? Had I seen anyone suspicious in the parking lot? Did I have any ex-boyfriends or former friends who might have a grudge? And I answered everything as best I could. And then I remembered the customer from the grocery store, the silent man who came in before closing. And I mentioned that I had seen a car in the store parking lot after my shift, and the same car was parked outside my building when I woke up. And I described the man and his behavior. And one of the officers wrote it all down and said they'd follow up on it. They took me to the station, and I spent the next 2 hours looking at photo arrays, trying to identify the customer from dozens of mugshots. And finally, I found him. Recognized those empty, tired eyes and that expressionless face. And the officer told me his name was Daniel Pritchard. He had a history of stalking and breaking and entering. He'd served time 7 years ago and had supposedly been rehabilitated. And they'd issue a warrant for his arrest immediately and patrol my neighborhood in case he returned. I stayed with my sister for the next week while police searched for Daniel Pritchard. And they found him 3 days later trying to enter another woman's apartment across town. And he was arrested and charged with multiple crimes, including breaking and entering and stalking. And in his car, they found photographs, dozens of photographs of me taken over the course of weeks. Pictures of me leaving my apartment, pictures of me at work, pictures of me through my bedroom window at night. And the police said he'd been watching me for at least a month, learning my schedule, learning my routines, waiting for the right opportunity. The detective assigned to my case, a woman named Rodriguez, sat down with me and walked me through everything they'd discovered. And she said I should prepare myself because some of the details were disturbing. And she explained that Daniel had been diagnosed with severe dissociative disorder and obsessive attachment syndrome, conditions that caused him to fixate on random individuals and construct elaborate fantasy relationships with them in his mind. And he'd done this before with at least 3 other women over the past decade, following them, photographing them, breaking into their homes to be near them while they slept. She said the photographs showed a progression of his obsession, starting with distant shots from across the parking lot and gradually becoming more intimate and invasive. Pictures taken from outside my apartment windows. Pictures that must have required him to climb the building's exterior maintenance ladder to reach the 2nd floor. And there were notes, 2 pages of handwritten observations about my daily routine. What time I left for work, what time I came home. Details that could only have been gathered through prolonged surveillance and multiple intrusions into my private space. The most disturbing discovery, Detective Rodriguez said, was that the night I'd woken up and found him in my closet was not the first time. He'd been inside my apartment while I slept. Based on the photographs and notes, they estimated he'd entered at least 6 or 7 times over the previous month. and he'd developed a ritual where he would hide in my closet for hours, just watching me sleep through the gap in the door. And sometimes he would come out after he was certain I was deeply asleep and stand beside my bed. And there were photographs of this, pictures taken with a camera timer showing him standing over me in the darkness. And knowing that this had happened multiple times without my awareness made me feel violated in a way I couldn't fully articulate. I moved to a different city 3 months later. Couldn't bear to stay in that apartment or that town where every familiar corner reminded me of the violation I'd experienced. And I got a new job at a different store in a different state. And for the first 6 months, I was paranoid about every customer who came through my line, searching their faces for signs of obsession or dangerous fixation, jumping at unexpected sounds in my new apartment, checking my closets and under my bed every single night before allowing myself to sleep. It's been almost 3 years now since that night when I woke up to find my bedroom door open and someone hiding in my closet watching me. And I still think about it more often than I'd like. Still have occasional nightmares where I see that eye reflecting light from the darkness. Still feel a jolt of anxiety when I notice something in my apartment slightly out of place. But the fear has lessened over time, has become more manageable. Something I can acknowledge and set aside rather than something that controls my entire life. If you're still watching this, still listening to these stories in the darkness of your own room, I want you to remember that the monsters we fear don't always announce themselves with broken windows and kicked-in doors. Sometimes they pick the lock while you're sleeping and stand in your closet counting your breaths until morning comes. So check your closets tonight. Check under your bed. Check any space large enough for a person to hide. Because the thing about stories like mine is they're not really stories at all. They're warnings. They're proof that safety is an illusion we maintain until someone decides to shatter it. Sleep carefully tonight. And remember that sometimes the most terrifying thing isn't what you can see in the dark, but what's been watching you all along from places you never thought to look. Story 3. The Watcher at the Driveway. I live in a small house in what most people would call a decent neighborhood. The kind of place where people wave at each other from their porches and kids ride bikes until the streetlights flicker on. And for the past 3 years, I've worked from home. My office set up in the spare bedroom upstairs with my desk positioned right beside a window that overlooks the front yard and the driveway below. I always liked having that window open during the warmer months, letting fresh air circulate through the room while I typed away at reports and attended video meetings. And on that particular October afternoon, the air was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of dried leaves and distant wood smoke. The kind of autumn day that makes you forget winter is coming. It was a Wednesday, I remember, because Wednesdays were always my heaviest workload. Back-to-back meetings from 9 in the morning until well past 3. And I was in the middle of reviewing a spreadsheet when something caught my attention in my peripheral vision. A dark shape that didn't belong in the usual scenery of passing cars and neighborhood dogs. I glanced up from my screen and felt my fingers freeze on the keyboard because there was a man standing at the end of my driveway, not walking past it or pausing to check his phone or tie his shoe. Just standing there with his hands at his sides and his face tilted upward toward my house. He was maybe 40 yards away, far enough that I couldn't make out specific details of his face, but close enough that I could see he was wearing dark clothes, jeans and a jacket despite the mild weather, and his posture was unnaturally still, like a mannequin someone had placed there as a prank. I stared at him for what felt like a full minute, but was probably only 10 or 15 seconds. My mind trying to rationalize what I was seeing, Maybe he was waiting for someone. Maybe he was a contractor checking out houses in the neighborhood. Maybe he was just lost and trying to get his bearings. But none of those explanations felt right, because his gaze never wavered from my house, from my window. And I had this creeping sensation that he could see me just as clearly as I could see him. Then, as suddenly as I'd noticed him, he turned and walked away, not hurried or suspicious. Just a casual stroll down the sidewalk until he disappeared around the corner. And I sat there feeling foolish for letting such a small thing unnerve me.
It's fine.
Telling myself it was nothing.
It's perfectly normal.
Just a random person who happened to stop in front of my house for a moment. I tried to refocus on my work, but found myself glancing out the window every few minutes, scanning the street for any sign of him. And when my next video call started, I positioned myself so I could keep one eye on the meeting and one eye on the view outside.
The first thing I noticed was a strange odor,
though nothing else
like
unusual
rotten,
happened for the rest of the day.
Metallic.
That night, I mentioned it to my brother during our regular phone call, describing the man and his strange behavior, and my brother laughed it off, saying I was probably just stir-crazy from working at home too much, that I needed to get out more and stop inventing mysteries where there weren't any. And I wanted to believe him, I really did, because the alternative was admitting that something about the encounter had genuinely frightened me in a way I couldn't quite articulate. The next day was Thursday, and I'd almost forgotten about the incident entirely.
That he was oblivious
my
to
mind
everything
occupied with a new project that required my full attention. And I was deep in concentration around 1 in the afternoon when that same prickling awareness made me look up from my screen. And there he was again, standing in the exact same spot at the end of my driveway. Same dark clothes, same unnaturally still posture, same upward gaze directed at my window. This time, I didn't hesitate or second guess what I was seeing. I stood up from my chair so abruptly that it rolled backward and hit the wall, and I moved closer to the window, pressing my face near the glass to get a better look at him. And even from that distance, I could see there was something wrong with his expression, something empty and fixed, like he wasn't really seeing my house, but rather looking through it at something only he could perceive.
It's already here.
My heart was hammering in my chest, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my back, because this was no coincidence. This was deliberate. This man had come back to the same spot at roughly the same time to stare at my home. At me, and I didn't know what that meant, but I knew it wasn't good. I grabbed my phone and considered calling the police, but what would I tell them? That someone was standing on a public sidewalk looking in the general direction of my property. They'd think I was paranoid or wasting their time, so instead I just watched him. And after about 90 seconds, he turned and walked away just like before, unhurried and calm, as if he'd completed some task that only made sense to him. The rest of Thursday passed in a blur of anxiety. I couldn't concentrate on work, couldn't eat dinner, couldn't think about anything except that man and his empty stare. And when I finally went to bed around 11, I made sure every door and window in the house was locked, double-checking them twice before climbing under the covers.
Every creak
and even then, I lay awake for hours, listening to every creak and groan of the old house settling, imagining footsteps on the porch or breath against the windows. Friday came, and I was exhausted from lack of sleep, my eyes burning and my thoughts sluggish as I made coffee and tried to convince myself that the man wouldn't return, that whatever strange compulsion had brought him to my driveway twice would surely not manifest a third time. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself, because patterns like that don't just stop without reason. I worked through the morning in a state of nervous anticipation, my eyes flicking to the window every few minutes. And when 1 o'clock passed without incident, I felt a small measure of relief, thinking maybe I'd been wrong. Maybe it was over, but then, at 1:40, almost an hour later than his previous appearances, I saw him again. Same position, same posture, same empty upward stare. And this time I felt anger mixing with my fear, because who was this person and what gave him the right to torment me like this? I stood at the window and stared back at him, refusing to look away, trying to communicate through sheer force of will that I saw him, that I knew what he was doing, that he couldn't intimidate me.
He was just standing.
But he didn't react at all, didn't acknowledge my presence in any way. Just continued his vigil until whatever internal clock he was following told him it was time to leave. And then he walked away like always, vanishing around the corner and leaving me shaking with adrenaline and confusion. The rest of Friday afternoon dragged on, but I couldn't focus on anything. I kept replaying those 3 encounters in my mind, trying to find some detail I'd missed, some clue that would explain what was happening. And I realized with growing dread that the man had never once looked surprised to see me watching him from the window, as if he'd known all along that I would notice him, as if being noticed was part of whatever sick game he was playing. That evening, around 8 o'clock, I ordered takeout because I couldn't stomach the thought of cooking. And while I was eating at my kitchen table, I heard footsteps on my front porch, slow and deliberate. The kind of footsteps that announce someone's presence rather than trying to conceal it. And I froze with a forkful of noodles halfway to my mouth, listening as the steps came closer to my door, paused for maybe 3 seconds, then retreated back down the porch steps and faded away. Now you might think I'm exaggerating when I say this, but sometimes the scariest thing isn't what jumps out at you in the dark. It's what stands in broad daylight and refuses to explain itself. And right now, I need you to do something for me. I need you to hit that subscribe button, because there are things in this world that don't make sense. Things that follow patterns we can't understand. And if you want to hear more stories like this one, stories that might help you recognize the signs when something isn't right in your own life, then subscribing is the least you can do. And while you're at it, tell me this: what color were the man's shoes? Did I ever mention them? Think carefully before you answer, because the first person to get it right will receive a small reward from me, the storyteller tonight, as a way of saying thank you for watching and supporting. And also, I'm curious, where are you watching this from right now? What time is it in your part of the world? Are you alone in your room or surrounded by others? Drop a comment with your location and local time, because I find it fascinating to know how far these stories travel, how many different places and time zones they reach. Something about knowing you're not alone in the darkness makes it slightly less terrifying, doesn't it? I stood up from the table and crept toward the front door, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. And I looked through the peephole, but saw nothing except the empty porch and the dim glow of the streetlight at the end of my driveway. And I stood there for a full minute, debating whether to open the door, whether to step outside and confront whatever had just been standing there. But my hand was trembling so badly I couldn't grip the doorknob properly. And finally, I stepped back, took a deep breath, and decided to wait until morning, convincing myself that whatever it was could wait until daylight. But then I noticed something taped to the outside of the door, visible through the small window pane at the top, a white rectangle that definitely hadn't been there before. And against every instinct screaming at me to leave it alone, I unlocked the deadbolt, turned the handle, and opened the door just wide enough to reach out and grab the paper, then slammed the door shut and locked it again, my hands shaking as I unfolded what turned out to be a piece of notebook paper with 3 words written in careful block letters. Pat answered the door, My name is Patrick, but everyone calls me Pat. Only my mother uses my full name, and seeing it written there by a stranger who'd been watching my house, who knew where I lived, and when I was home, and what window I worked beside, made my blood run cold in a way I'd never experienced before. Because this wasn't random anymore. This wasn't some weird coincidence or case of mistaken identity. This was targeted. This was personal. This was someone who'd chosen me specifically for reasons I couldn't begin to understand. I called the police immediately, not caring anymore if I sounded paranoid or foolish. And 2 officers arrived within 20 minutes, and I told them everything. About the man standing at my driveway 3 days in a row, about the footsteps on my porch, about the note with my name on it. And they took it seriously enough to write a report and take the note as evidence. But they also said there wasn't much they could do unless the person made a direct threat or attempt to harm me. That standing on a public sidewalk wasn't illegal. That even the note, while unsettling, didn't constitute a crime. And they advised me to install security cameras and call again if anything else happened. And then they left, and I was alone again with my fear and my questions. I didn't sleep at all Friday night. I sat in my living room with all the lights on and a kitchen knife on the coffee table beside me, watching the front door and listening for any sound that didn't belong. And the hours crawled by with agonizing slowness, midnight becoming 1 a.m., becoming 2 a.m. And I was starting to think maybe the police visit had scared him off. Maybe just knowing that I'd reported him would be enough to make him stop. But then, at exactly 1:53 in the morning, I heard it. A knock at the front door, not loud or aggressive, just a normal knock, like someone making a friendly visit. And it was that normalcy that made it so deeply wrong, because who knocks on a stranger's door at 2 in the morning as if it's the most natural thing in the world?